In 2007, an entire youth choir vanished without a trace during a stormy evening rehearsal in a small Oregon town. 23 teenagers. 2 adults. 1 isolated chapel. No witnesses. No evidence. No answers. 17 years later, in 2024, a rescue dog uncovers a sealed tunnel beneath the chapel ruins, and a survivor reappears, broken and silent. Before we dive in, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us create more deep and gripping stories just for you. There's more to come. It was supposed to be a routine rehearsal, one last run-through before the Sunday service. On the night of October 14th, 2007, 23 members of the St. Michael's Youth Choir arrived at the old chapel on the outskirts of Marrow Creek, a quiet town nestled between thick Oregon forests and rolling hills. The sky had been threatening rain since the afternoon, and by nightfall, the storm had arrived with full force. Violent wind, booming thunder, and sheets of rain hammering the ground. The St. Michael Chapel was over a century old, abandoned for years before being restored by a local religious group. It stood at the edge of a wooded bluff, miles from the nearest highway. It had no security cameras, no cell reception, and one narrow road leading in. Parents were told the kids would be rehearsing for 2 hours before being picked up. None of them expected that it would be the last time they'd see their children. At 10:18 p.m., a parent waiting in the rain placed a call to the local police after repeated knocks on the chapel's heavy wooden doors went unanswered. Officers arrived 20 minutes later. They found the chapel completely empty. Not vandalized, not ransacked, just vacant. Music sheets were still on stands. Backpacks sat beside chairs. Jackets were slung over pews. Phones and purses remained untouched. A tray of uneaten snacks still rested on a side table. The only sound was the creaking of old wood under storm winds. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No tire tracks or footprints leading away. The choir's director, 2 volunteers, and all 20 of the teenagers were simply gone. What followed was the most extensive search effort in Marrow Creek's history. For weeks, local law enforcement, volunteer groups, and state search and rescue teams combed through forests, caves, and nearby ravines. Helicopters scanned the canopy. Dogs sniffed through overgrowth and moss. Divers checked the nearby lake. But the area offered nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of fabric, not even a single fingerprint out of place. The town fell into a spiral of grief and speculation. Some believed the group had staged their own disappearance. Others claimed it was a mass abduction, maybe by someone they trusted. The more paranoid blamed cults, rogue survivalist groups, or secret tunnels from an old war era. But every theory eventually dissolved into the same blank wall. No evidence, no bodies, no answers. The chapel was eventually shuttered again, this time sealed and left to rot. Over the years, the story became a ghost tale, a whispered local legend, something to scare kids around campfires. The vanishing choir of St. Michael. 17 years passed, and then, in early spring of 2024, during a training exercise just outside the ruined chapel, a German Shepherd rescue dog named Bramble began barking uncontrollably at the edge of the hill. Her handler followed her as she pawed furiously at the wet earth near a collapsed stone wall. Within minutes, the dog had unearthed something impossible, a narrow slab of rotting wood. A hidden hatch. Beneath it, darkness. A sealed tunnel. Untouched since 2007. October 14th, 2007. The last day anyone saw the St. Michael's Youth Choir alive. The morning started like any other Sunday. Church service, casual brunches, and scattered texts about homework and choir practice. But underneath the surface, something was off. Subtle but real. Maria Welton, the newest member of the choir, arrived late that morning, as usual. She barely spoke, avoided eye contact, and flinched at sudden sounds. People whispered about the bruises on her arms, the way she clutched her notebook like a shield. She had transferred to Marrow Creek High just a month earlier and joined the choir after being personally invited by Lucas Garner. Lucas was the golden boy of the town, son of the pastor, lead soloist, and the kind of teenager whose every action was seen as promising. But that day he was different. Agitated. He was barking orders during rehearsal, pushing the group to try an unfamiliar arrangement he claimed was meant for something bigger. He called it a purification sequence, though no one quite knew what that meant. Emma Drake, ever the skeptic, raised her eyebrows during the run-through. Known for her sharp tongue and even sharper blog posts on religious overreach, she had long been a thorn in Lucas's side. That day, she whispered to another soprano, "This whole thing smells like ego worship." But she sang anyway. She always did. Singing gave her leverage. The storm had started to build by late afternoon. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, casting the chapel in a gloomy half-light. A town-wide weather alert warned of high winds and lightning, but Lucas insisted the group proceed. "This is the last time we rehearse before next week's performance," he reminded them, "and it's too important to cancel." The official rehearsal was set for 5 p.m., but Lucas rescheduled it to 8:30 p.m. "The evening air helps you project," he said. A few parents raised concerns, especially with the worsening weather, but were reassured by Lucas's father and the choir director that the chapel was safe and well-stocked with emergency supplies. Several students, including 2 younger altos and a tenor, tried to back out. Maria was seen near the entrance, quietly asking if she could leave early. Lucas pulled her aside. No one knows what he said, but she stayed. By 9:12 p.m., all 23 choir members were inside, seated and rehearsing. Rain pelted the stained glass windows. Thunder shook the floorboards. One student texted his mom, "This storm's nuts. Lucas is still making us sing. We sound like we're calling ghosts." It was the last message sent from inside the chapel. According to emergency services, the last recorded landline call from the church was made at 9:46 p.m., an incomplete outgoing dial tone. No words, no voice, just silence, and then a click. When the first parent arrived to pick up their child around 10:15, the chapel doors were locked from the inside. They knocked. No answer. They circled the building. No movement. Eventually, they tried the side door. It wouldn't budge, and by the time they returned to the front, the hallway lights inside the chapel had gone out. No one ever saw the choir again. The woman walked into the Marrow Creek police station just after sunrise on April 7, 2024. She was barefoot, wearing a gray hospital gown beneath a tattered hoodie. Her hair was uneven, hacked short in places, matted in others. Her arms were lined with scars, old, new, surgical, and self-inflicted. Her posture was tight, shoulders hunched, as if she expected every sound to be a threat. At first, the desk sergeant thought she was a transient or a victim of abuse. She didn't speak. She just stood in the doorway, trembling, her lips moving without sound. When asked her name, she froze. Then finally, almost in a whisper, she said, "Maria." That was it. Standard procedure kicked in. She was escorted to a quiet room, offered food and water. She didn't eat. She stared at her hands the entire time, flinching when anyone touched her. Her fingers twitched in a rhythmic pattern, like she was pressing invisible piano keys. When they ran her prints through the system, the entire department came to a halt. Maria Welton, declared legally deceased in 2010. One of the 23 teens who vanished during the St. Michael's Chapel incident. A name that had haunted the town for over a decade. They brought in specialists, trauma counselors, a detective from the original case. None could get much out of her. She remained withdrawn, speaking only in fragments. But one sentence broke the silence. She said it slowly, eyes locked on the floor. "We were underground. Not all of us made it out." The room went still. No one dared interrupt. When pressed further, "Where, how, who?" she clamped up. Her breathing became shallow, panic welling in her eyes. A nurse sedated her, and she was transported to the Marrow Creek Medical Center for observation. Detective Renner, now retired but still obsessed with the case, was called in. He stared at her through the one-way glass. "That's her," he whispered. "I'd know those eyes anywhere." To confirm, they took a DNA sample and rushed it to the state crime lab in Salem. 3 days later, the results came back. 100% match. No error. No doubt. Maria Welton was alive. She was 30 years old, but medical tests suggested long-term malnutrition and psychological trauma. Her wrists bore marks consistent with restraints. Her feet were deformed, possibly from years of walking barefoot on uneven surfaces. There were traces of fungal exposure consistent with long-term underground habitation. But none of that explained where she had been, or how she had survived. The official press release was cautious. No accusations, no theories. Just a quiet acknowledgement. One member of the St. Michael's Choir had returned. The town held its breath. And late that night, under heavy sedation, Maria whispered something else to the nurse watching over her. Lucas said the silence meant we were chosen. She turned to the wall and began humming. A melody long forgotten, a hymn no one had heard since 2007. Except she remembered every note. It took weeks before Maria could speak in full sentences. Even then, her recollections came in fragments, whispered thoughts stitched together through trauma. She often stared at the corners of rooms when she spoke, as if afraid someone was watching. Doctors warned that her memories might be distorted, a defense mechanism. But investigators had no better lead. So they listened. What Maria described was not supernatural. It was worse. It was human. She said the choir was not taken by force. We were told it was a retreat, she explained. A spiritual service project. A way to connect. More deeply. According to her, Lucas Garner and the choir director, Mr. Ackerley, had spent weeks preparing a sacred music program that would bring them closer to God. On the night of the storm, the teens were asked to stay late. When thunder rattled the stained glass and the lights flickered, no one thought much of it. They were told to stay calm. They rehearsed in candlelight. Then, around 9:30 p.m., Lucas told them the time had come. He opened a door hidden behind the chapel's storage area. Maria had never noticed it before, a narrow stairwell descending beneath the church. The kids hesitated. It smelled of dust and rust. But Mr. Ackerley smiled, said it was an emergency rehearsal space, protected from the storm. Some resisted. A few said they wanted to go home. But Lucas insisted. One night, he said. One night of commitment to prove your faith. Maria remembered his voice shaking, not from fear, but excitement. They descended in silence, one by one, into the tunnels. The space was larger than anyone expected. Damp corridors, flickering battery lights, and a room with rows of cots and musical stands. Water dripped from the ceiling. The walls were concrete, marked with faded church symbols and what looked like decades-old wiring. They were told it was part of a forgotten Cold War fallout shelter, repurposed by the church decades ago. It would be their place of transformation. The group was told they'd be there for 3 days, to fast, pray, and rehearse without distraction. That was the first lie. Once they were inside, the door was locked. Their phones were collected for safety. Food was limited to ration packs and water. Bathroom access was supervised. There was no clock, no daylight, no way to tell how long they'd been there. Every day they sang. Hours of hymns, spiritual chants, and silence in between. They were told to write down their sins, burn the pages, and sing for forgiveness. We were being broken down, Maria said, and remade. She recalled Mr. Ackerley watching from the shadows, always listening. But it was Lucas who enforced the rules. He began punishing those who resisted, not violently at first, just restrictions. Less food, no blanket, cold showers. Then worse. Maria's voice cracked as she described it. He said obedience was cleansing. That suffering brought us closer. She didn't say what happened to the first boy who refused to sing, but her silence said enough. 2 weeks after Maria's breakthrough, excavation began at the base of the ruined St. Michael Chapel. A joint task force, local authorities, forensic specialists, and structural engineers descended on the site with shovels, ground-penetrating radar, and portable lighting rigs. The narrow hatch discovered by the rescue dog had been partially collapsed by years of erosion and debris. But beneath it, they confirmed what Maria had claimed, a man-made access shaft, reinforced with concrete and steel. It took 4 days to fully breach the tunnel. Once opened, stale air spilled out like a tomb exhaling. The temperature dropped instantly. The interior was silent, save for the drip of condensation onto rusted metal. The first thing they found were beds. Cots. Rough, military-style metal frames stacked side by side in a low-ceilinged chamber. The mattresses were long-rotted, reduced to canvas scraps and wire springs. Mold crept up the walls. In one corner sat a stack of water jugs, cracked and empty. Another corner had a primitive latrine built from buckets and plywood. This wasn't a fallout shelter. It was a prison. Personal belongings were scattered around the room. Cracked eyeglasses, a comb, faded notebooks. One bore the name Emma Drake in neat cursive. Inside were lyrics to hymns. And on the final page, a shaky line that read, "I don't think we're ever going home." In the main corridor, they found what looked like a communal area. Rusted music stands were arranged in a semicircle. Several still held yellowed sheets of choral arrangements. One flashlight lay at the center, long dead. A tape recorder sat next to it, its batteries corroded and leaking. But the most chilling find was deeper in. A narrow passageway led to a smaller chamber at the far end of the tunnel system. There, a wall of cinder blocks had been used as a kind of message board. On it were names, handwritten in black marker. All 23 choir members. Alongside each name was a series of tallies, possibly dates or infractions. Next to some, phrases like asleep, silent, or unworthy. 17 names were crossed out with thick red strokes. Maria's name wasn't. Instead, hers had been traced over multiple times in blue ink. Around it, stars, lines, and a note in block letters, "Still listening." Detective Renner stared at the wall for a long time. He didn't speak. No one did. The forensics team began photographing the site, logging evidence, and preserving the air samples. Investigators speculated that the red slashes denoted deaths, possibly during the 42 days Maria claimed they'd been held underground. The day 42, scrawled above the wall, reinforced that timeline. But the meaning of the symbols around Maria's name? No one could say. That night, back at the temporary command center, one of the junior officers played back a field audio recording from inside the chamber. At first, only static. Then, faintly, barely audible, a voice. Singing. A girl's voice. One line. "We wait in silence, still beneath." Then nothing. The deeper investigators delved into the evidence, the clearer the picture became. The choir hadn't simply been kidnapped or trapped. They had been systematically isolated, manipulated, and reprogrammed. Maria's interviews, now more coherent with the help of trauma counselors, painted a haunting timeline. The process hadn't started underground. It began weeks earlier, in plain sight. According to her, the choir's rehearsals in the months leading up to the disappearance had changed in tone. Lucas Garner, once simply the pastor's son and lead soloist, began pushing a message beyond music. He spoke of letting go of worldly noise and sacrificing the flesh to purify the soul. At first, most of the kids thought it was just dramatic religious language, until the rules started changing. Phones were banned during practice. Personal journals were to be turned in for spiritual review. Any conversations outside the choir about rehearsal content were discouraged. Members were told that they were preparing for a higher calling and would soon become vessels. Parents noted the shift. Some complained, but Pastor Elijah Garner, Lucas's father and the most influential spiritual figure in town, brushed it off as adolescent focus. "We're building discipline," he had said at one PDA meeting. "Distraction is the enemy of devotion." Now, after Maria's return, many began to see what lay beneath that polished rhetoric. Detective Renner and his team uncovered pages from Elijah Garner's private sermons. Stored in a flood-damaged box at the now-abandoned parish office, many were coded in religious metaphor. But a few entries were more direct. "Obedience isn't earned. It's demanded by the righteous. When the sheep stray, the shepherd must not fear the rod. True disciples must suffer separation to be reborn." It was clear now. The retreat under the chapel wasn't a desperate last-minute shelter from storm. It was a premeditated plan. Maria confirmed that Lucas, under his father's direction, began introducing rituals weeks before the storm. Silent meals, assigned prayer partners, reflection fasts, where they weren't allowed to speak for entire days. Any disobedience was met with subtle punishment, extra chores, withheld food, public shaming. They called it purification, Maria said quietly, but it felt like being erased. The most disturbing element was how the group turned on itself. After enough deprivation, many of the choir members began enforcing the rules themselves, correcting each other, reporting impure thoughts, adopting the language of their captors. It wasn't just control from above. It was peer pressure turned psychological warfare. "They made us believe we chose it," Maria whispered. "That staying was holy. That doubting was sin. But not everyone accepted it. One boy, Nathan Chase, a 16-year-old baritone known for his sarcastic humor, began resisting early. According to Maria, he questioned everything, mocked the silence, challenged Lucas openly. He tried to keep morale up by joking, even singing parody versions of the hymns. And then one night, he was gone. His cot was empty, his belongings left behind. No goodbye. When Maria asked where he went, Lucas looked at her with calm certainty and said, "Nathan chose noise. We won't hear him anymore." She never saw him again. In the absence of light, clocks, or contact with the outside world, time blurred. Days melted into one another. And in that vacuum, Lucas Garner took control. Officially, he was just another choir member, a peer. But underground, within the tunnel system beneath St. Michael Chapel, he became something more, something dangerous. Maria described the shift as gradual. At first, Lucas framed everything in spiritual language. He quoted scripture, referenced his father's teachings, and spoke of their isolation as a chosen test. According to him, the choir was meant to be broken away from the world, purified through silence, suffering, and submission. They weren't lost. They were blessed. He spoke softly, with conviction, and many listened. Over time, the others began referring to him as the shepherd, mimicking his phrases. Maria admitted even she caught herself parroting his words. In a world reduced to dark tunnels, cold meals, and group chants, Lucas offered clarity, even if it came at a cost. Then came the punishments. When members disobeyed, by crying, refusing to sing, speaking during silence periods, Lucas would assign them cleansing fasts. This meant skipped meals, isolation, and sometimes hours standing alone in a dark corridor, facing the wall. At first, others watched in uncomfortable silence. Then, they began enforcing the rules too, mimicking Lucas's authority, out of fear or devotion. By the third week underground, Lucas wasn't just leading. He was dominating. Lucas pushed one boy against a wall for talking back. He grabbed a girl by the wrist, so hard it bruised when she asked to leave. "Pain is temporary," he told them, "but obedience is eternal." He claimed to receive messages through the silence, that God spoke to him directly, that those who struggled to follow were clouded by sin. He kept a notebook filled with names, notes, rankings, a ledger of obedience. Maria remembered sitting across from him, being told to confess her doubts aloud in front of the group. When she hesitated, he placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "You're being reborn." But not everyone fell under his control. Emma Drake, the independent-minded blogger and outspoken critic of church hypocrisy, was never convinced. She played along publicly, nodded, sang, even fasted. But privately, she kept a secret. In the back corner of her cot, beneath the ragged lining of a backpack, Emma hid a small notebook and a pencil stub. It wasn't much. But every night, when the others drifted into exhausted sleep, she would scribble what she saw, what Lucas said, and what was changing in them. She wrote names, dates, as best she could guess, and disturbing details of punishments. She made charts of who obeyed and who resisted. In one entry later recovered, her handwriting trembled. "Lucas thinks he's saving us. I think he's trying to become someone else. This isn't faith. It's a slow erasure." Emma knew the truth, how to survive, even if they didn't. And in the darkness of the tunnels, her journal became the only witness left willing to remember everything. By the fourth week underground, the authority of the adults began to crumble. 2 staff members had entered the tunnels that stormy night in 2007. Mr. Ackerley, the choir director, and Ms. Grace Halpern, a youth counselor from the church. At first, they seemed like figures of calm. They comforted the students, helped organize sleeping spaces, and reassured everyone that this spiritual retreat would end soon. But as days passed and the exit remained sealed, their tone shifted. Mr. Ackerley became erratic. His voice shook during prayers, his hands trembled. He often stared at Lucas with uneasy glances, like he'd lost control of something he thought he was leading. Ms. Halpern began withdrawing, spending hours alone in a storage alcove with a Bible and a pocket journal. They were unraveling, Maria said during one of her interviews. You could see it. They realized they'd made a mistake. but they didn't know how to stop it without being seen as traitors. The children, meanwhile, were rapidly falling under Lucas's control. When Ms. Halpern suggested ending the fasts and letting students speak freely, Lucas stood and publicly accused her of spiritual cowardice. He told the group she was spreading weakness. That night, her bedding was moved to the far side of the chamber, isolated from the rest. Mr. Ackerley began spending more time in the tunnel junction closest to the sealed exit, muttering to himself. One night, Maria awoke to the sound of him pacing back and forth, repeating the phrase, "We shouldn't have sealed it. We should have never sealed it." A day later, both adults vanished. Lucas told the choir they had ascended. The truth came 17 years later, when forensic teams uncovered a locked utility room off one of the side passages. Inside were two decomposed bodies, both partially covered in blankets. Near Mr. Ackerley's body, an empty pill bottle. Next to Ms. Halpern, her journal, open to a final, nearly illegible entry. They believe in him now. I don't. I never did. I only wanted them to feel strong. But this is control dressed as faith. I see it too late. Toxicology reports later confirmed traces of sedatives and depressants in their remains. Likely suicide, or possibly desperation-fueled overdose. With the adults gone, Lucas no longer had to share power. He didn't announce his leadership. He simply filled the vacuum. He organized everything. Sleep schedules, punishments, the daily cleansing rituals that involved hours of singing in pitch darkness. He stopped responding to his own name. To the others, he became shepherd. One evening, according to Maria, Lucas made a quiet announcement. He said the final stage was near, that God had whispered it in the silence. He instructed the choir to gather in the largest tunnel chamber, where a crude altar of bricks and melted candles had been built. He called it the night of purification, and then he told them, "Tomorrow, the ones who remain will be saved, but only the silent will rise." That night, Maria saw him sharpening a piece of metal into a blade. What happened after the so-called night of purification remains fractured in Maria's mind, shards of memory layered with exhaustion, panic, and grief. But one thing was clear, it marked a breaking point. Lucas had pushed them too far. The rituals grew more severe. Food became scarcer. Speaking out of turn meant total isolation. Anyone who resisted singing during the mandatory nightly chants was confined to the silence corner, a cramped, pitch-black utility shaft that reeked of mold and metal. One morning, 2 girls were found unconscious from dehydration. Lucas called it a test of faith. One regained consciousness after being spoon-fed water. The other never woke up. That was when a small group decided to run. Maria wasn't part of the initial attempt. She had grown too weak, her legs aching from days of malnourishment. But she overheard the planning. Emma, always the watcher, the recorder, was part of it, along with a boy named Jonah and a set of twins who hadn't spoken in days. They waited until Lucas fell asleep, though no one was sure if he ever truly did anymore. Then, with a dim flashlight Emma had hidden in her mattress, they slipped through one of the maintenance corridors that led to the western edge of the underground complex. They didn't come back. The next morning, Lucas gathered everyone. He was calm, emotionless. "They chose to stray," he said, his voice nearly a whisper. "Pray they find the light. But they will not return." Days passed. Maria and the others began hearing distant noises, metal groans, occasional thuds, echoing through the tunnel walls. Whether it was their imagination, structural shifts, or something else, no one could say. Water supplies were nearly gone. The jugs found in storage were nearly dry. One of the younger girls began hallucinating. She spoke to walls, sang lullabies to shadows. Another boy, Nico, was found curled in a fetal position, humming the same 3 notes over and over. They were unraveling. "I stopped feeling fear at that point," Maria said later. "I felt numb, like we weren't even people anymore. Just echoes." And then something shifted. During one of the daily cleansing walks through the tunnels, Maria slipped behind the group and ducked into an old maintenance shaft she hadn't noticed before. She crawled deeper, ignoring the pain from her scraped knees and splinters. The air grew colder. The light from her stolen candle flickered low. That's when she saw it. A vertical metal pipe bolted into the concrete, corroded, cracked, and trailing upward. A ventilation shaft. The grating at the top was rusted through. She tested it. It wobbled. Maria knew it might be her only chance. Maria didn't know how long she sat at the base of the broken ventilation shaft, staring upward through rusted steel and crumbling concrete. It felt like hours. It could have been days. Her body was fragile, her mind fogged by starvation, fear, and exhaustion. But something in her stirred, a final thread of instinct. Survival. She began climbing. The shaft was barely wide enough to fit her body. The inner walls were lined with sharp edges, bolts, and loose wiring. Her palms bled as she pulled herself upward, pressing her feet into slick, unstable brackets. Twice she nearly slipped. Once she blacked out and caught herself just before tumbling back into darkness. But at the top, after what felt like her last breath, the grate gave way with a metallic groan. Cool air flooded her lungs. Fresh, pine-scented cold. She pulled herself on a soft soil, collapsing among tangled ferns and moss. Overhead, the trees shivered in the wind. She had emerged somewhere in the dense forest beyond the chapel, far from the road, far from anything familiar. Maria was 17. She hadn't seen sunlight in over a month. Her skin was pale and bruised, her lips cracked, and her eyes barely adjusted to the natural light. She walked barefoot for 2 days. What she remembered of those days came in flashes: drinking from a stream, sleeping under a tree during rainfall, hiding from headlights, trying to speak, and realizing her voice barely worked. Eventually, her body gave out. She collapsed by a roadside where she was found by a passing driver, a man who thought she'd escaped some kind of trafficking ring. She was taken to a local hospital in another county, severely dehydrated, suffering from memory loss, and unable to answer even basic questions. Trauma-induced amnesia, they said. The facility placed her in a shelter for runaway teens. With no way to identify her, no fingerprints in the system, and no one looking in the right places, she slipped through the cracks. She was given a new name, a new birthday, a new life. For 17 years, Maria lived in quiet anonymity under the name Anna Jensen. She worked odd jobs, kept to herself, and avoided news coverage. Somewhere inside her, she knew she was missing pieces, but never dared to go searching. Until 2024. She was at a laundromat when she saw it. A headline flashing on the overhead TV. Tunnel found beneath ruins of St. Michael Chapel. Possible link to 2007 choir disappearance. The screen showed a grainy photo, police tape, a search dog, officials crowded around a dark hole in the ground. The news segment played a short, low-quality audio clip captured inside the tunnel. Maria dropped her laundry basket. In that moment, the memories returned, all of them. She collapsed to the floor, whispering the last words Lucas ever said to her. The silence remembers you. The moment Maria Welton's identity was confirmed, the St. Michael Choir disappearance was officially reopened as an active criminal investigation. What had been filed away as a cold case, a tragic anomaly, was now reclassified: criminal conspiracy, wrongful imprisonment, and negligent death. The public, stunned by Maria's reemergence, demanded answers. Local officials, many of whom had quietly distanced themselves from the 2007 incident, now faced intense scrutiny. The Oregon State Bureau of Investigation assigned a special task force to review the original records, cross-examine surviving church members, and search financial and legal archives tied to the St. Michael Parish. What they uncovered raised far more questions than it answered. The first red flag came from budgetary anomalies. St. Michael Youth Ministries, officially a modest community outreach branch, had received a significant spike in funding in the 2 years leading up to the choir's disappearance. Bank records showed multiple large transfers, amounting to over $900,000, from 3 anonymous donor accounts filtered through shell nonprofits. All 3 were traced back to defunct charitable organizations with vague religious mission statements, registered out of state, and dissolved soon after 2007. One was called the Garden of the Returning Voice. Another, Sons of Silence International. The listed addresses led to vacant lots or private mailboxes in abandoned industrial parks. All bore the same pattern: created quickly, funneled funds, then vanished. Investigators also discovered that Pastor Elijah Garner, Lucas's father, had traveled extensively in the years before the incident, speaking at fringe theological conferences and closed-door religious retreats, known for promoting extreme devotional immersion. One such event was held in a compound outside Flagstaff, Arizona, now linked to multiple reports of coercive behavior and psychological manipulation. How much of this funding or ideology influenced what happened beneath St. Michael Chapel was still unknown. But then came the real breakthrough. In the damp, barely preserved archives of the old parish office, what remained of it after a minor flood in 2013, detectives found a sealed manila envelope tucked between financial reports. Inside, photos. Old, curling at the edges, but clear enough. One showed a young Lucas Garner, not yet 18, standing beside a man in a dark suit with a clerical collar. Behind them, a banner that read, "The Chosen Must Lead." Another photo showed Lucas shaking hands with two men wearing name badges from an international missionary delegation. One of them was later identified as a former executive of one of the dissolved donor funds. These were no youth choir events. These were ideological gatherings, and Lucas had attended them. Someone was grooming him, said one investigator, and they had a purpose. The timeline was tightening. The belief that Lucas acted alone, or even just under his father's direction, was slipping. This was bigger. And just before closing the folder, one detective flipped over the final photo. On the back, in faded ink, "Our Shepherd in Training." The first of many. The officer pulled out his phone and ran the name of the man in the photo, and found out he had recently checked into a religious retreat center less than 40 miles away. As excavation crews pushed deeper into the second arm of the tunnel system beneath St. Michael Chapel, progress slowed. The passages were unstable, partially collapsed, and saturated with decades of moisture. But on May 4th, 2024, a team uncovered a narrow crawl space sealed by a concrete wall that had fractured under the weight of erosion. Behind it, they found a small chamber, barely large enough for one person to lie down, and in it a body. It was curled against the wall, arms folded over its chest, clothing reduced to tatters but still identifiable, a choir jacket, worn and faded. Clipped to the collar was a laminated badge. Lucas Garner, music coordinator. The discovery sent a ripple through the investigation team. How they finally found him. The orchestrator of the underground imprisonment, the self-proclaimed shepherd. The body was remarkably well preserved, thanks to the cool, sealed environment. A state of natural mummification. Forensics were immediately brought in. Initial analysis noted no clear signs of trauma. A plastic water bottle and an empty ration pack were found nearby, suggesting a slow death, likely from dehydration or starvation. But within days, the results shattered the narrative. It wasn't Lucas Garner. DNA testing confirmed it. The body belonged to Micah Kearns, a 17-year-old tenor from the choir. He had no disciplinary history, no clear ties to leadership. His name hadn't appeared in Lucas's obedience notebook, recovered from the chamber. He was quiet, average, unremarkable, and yet he'd been found alone, in a sealed-off space, wearing Lucas's badge. It didn't make sense, until Maria was shown the photo. Her face went pale. "That's not Lucas," she said immediately. "That's Micah. I remember his voice. He used to sing harmony with Emma." "Could Lucas have given him his badge?" the detective asked. Maria didn't answer at first. Then she whispered, "Or made him wear it, in case anyone ever found him." The implication was chilling. Had Lucas used Micah as a decoy? A body to bury the trail? Had he staged his own death, planning his exit long before the collapse? Investigators began combing through sightings, old tips, and out-of-state records. Most were dead ends, but one stood out. A retired nurse in Idaho contacted the hotline. She had worked at a small Christian rehabilitation center for at-risk youth in 2011. She remembered a young man, deeply charismatic, unervingly persuasive, who volunteered for 3 months, helping lead prayer circles and music therapy. He used the name Eli Shepherd. She was shown an aged photo of Lucas Garner. "I'm not 100% sure," she said. "But, yes, that looks like him." The eyes were the same. Dead calm. Further digging uncovered that Eli Shepherd had applied to at least 2 other religious organizations across state lines, both under different names. Both accepted him. No red flags were raised. A new witness comes forward, a resident of a gated Christian community in Montana, and says a man named Brother Luke leads their youth choir and looks exactly like the boy from the news. As the truth began to surface, Marrow Creek split in two. For years, the town had buried the trauma of the St. Michael disappearance beneath silence and sentiment. The memorial plaques, the choir reunions with no choir, the empty pews that still bore names in gold paint. But now, with Maria Welton alive, Lucas Garner possibly at large, and a mummified body identified as someone else, the community was forced to confront something far uglier. Not everyone was ready. While some residents demanded justice, calling for criminal charges, federal involvement, and a full investigation into the church's finances and doctrine, others clung to the myth. They called Lucas a visionary, a misunderstood prophet, a victim of spiritual persecution. Old recordings of Pastor Garner's sermons resurfaced, fueling debates. Local church elders who had stayed quiet for decades began speaking, some condemning what had happened, others defending the devotional project as a misunderstood act of faith. Town hall meetings turned into shouting matches. A local councilwoman resigned after death threats. Parents who had lost children began receiving anonymous calls, some offering support, others warning them to let sleeping saints lie. A candlelight vigil for the victims was interrupted by protesters holding signs that read, "Purity was the point. Obedience is not abuse." At the center of it all stood Maria, once a ghost, now a symbol, both of survival and betrayal, depending on who was asked. Her interviews drew national attention. News anchors called her brave, raw, honest, but others called her a liar, a disgrace, a manipulator. The threats started as online comments, then emails, then notes slipped under the door of the safe house. She was placed in under protective custody. One morning, her assigned officer found the tires of their unmarked vehicle slashed. The next, a dead bird was left outside the motel room where she was being housed, with a ribbon from an old choir robe tied around its neck. The FBI began investigating connections between the church's past donors and current faith-based academies across the country. Several institutions were quietly shut down. In Tennessee, a similar tunnel was found beneath a now-defunct reform school. In Utah, 2 boys claimed they had been held in vocal correction chambers, where they were forced to sing hymns in darkness. A movement began, a growing suspicion that St. Michael had not been an isolated case, but rather one of many experiments in faith-based control. And through it all, Maria barely slept. Her trauma resurfaced. She began humming old hymns without realizing it, fingers twitching through phantom piano keys. Sometimes she'd wake up screaming. Then, one evening, as she returned from a closed-door interview, she found an envelope taped to her motel door. No name, no stamp, just 6 words, typed on plain paper. "You never finish your last song." In June 2024, veteran investigative journalist Nina Caraway arrived in Marrow Creek with a single goal: to tell the story no one else dared to finish. Unlike the fast-moving headlines and sensational cable coverage, Nina worked slowly, methodically. She wasn't interested in shock value. She wanted the full arc, the human cost, the systems that enabled it, and the silence that had kept it hidden for nearly 2 decades. She spent weeks interviewing survivors, parents, retired officers, and archivists. She reviewed every document from the reopened case files, taped interviews, financial statements, internal church memos, coroner's reports, excavation logs. With Maria's consent, she also read Emma Drake's recovered journal, now considered the most complete first-hand account of the time underground. Nina's series, titled The Choir Below, America's Devotion Cults, launched on June 28th as a long-form article accompanied by a podcast. The first installment was called "The Tunnel Was Real. The Silence Was Taught." Within 24 hours, it had 4 million views. Within 48, over 12 million. It spread like wildfire, not just because of the tragedy or the cruelty or even Lucas Garner himself, but because others began to come forward. Emails flooded Nina's inbox from across the country. Former students from so-called reform academies and devotion camps described eerily similar experiences: forced silence, hymn repetition, isolation chambers, food deprivation. Parents recounted how they had been promised spiritual realignment for their difficult teens, only to be cut off from communication and told to trust the process. Some of the names matched nonprofits connected to the same financial network that once funded St. Michael. A pattern began to emerge. What was once considered a tragedy, perhaps even a unique, twisted case, now looked like part of a systemic network of religious exploitation, masked by scripture and protected by legal loopholes. Nina's second article featured redacted invoices, internal training manuals, and hidden camera footage from a recently shuttered faith camp in Arkansas. Public outcry grew. Federal hearings were proposed. The Department of Education opened an audit into private religious institutions operating outside state standards. But the final blow, the one that changed everything, came from a quiet tech analyst working freelance for a European transit monitoring firm. He was reviewing facial recognition logs at a metro station in Riga, Latvia, during a routine update when he saw a flag triggered by a global missing persons database. He double-checked the timestamp, then the software. Then he sent the image to Interpol, and finally, to Nina. The still frame was low resolution but clear enough. A man, mid-30s, slender, dressed in clerical black, boarding a train to Daugavpils. The facial match came back at 87% confidence. The name on the international watch list? Lucas Garner. By autumn of 2024, the fallout from the reopened St. Michael's investigation had reshaped public discourse across the country. Thanks to Nina Carraway's reporting and Maria Welton's testimony, a congressional subcommittee on religious education and youth welfare was formed. Hearings were broadcast live, featuring testimonies from survivors, whistleblowers, and auditors. The Department of Justice began issuing subpoenas. Within weeks, 4 former executives of the dissolved nonprofits tied to the St. Michael Chapel were indicted for wire fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment. 2 pled guilty. 1 fled the country. Another, a former church board member, was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Faith-based institutions across 5 states shut down voluntarily. Others were ordered to comply with emergency oversight or face dissolution. A long-ignored network of devotional academies, once buried under tax exemptions and parental waivers, was finally exposed. But one name remained off every arrest list: Lucas Garner. Interpol confirmed the Latvian metro sighting, but was unable to track his movements past the station. Local authorities searched nearby religious compounds, shelters, even abandoned monasteries. No trace. A composite sketch of him, aged up to his mid-30s, was released worldwide. Tip lines were flooded. Rumors ranged from him hiding under a new identity in Europe to whispers that he had been seen leading worship in an isolated mountain community in northern Canada. But no confirmation ever came. Maria returned to a guarded location, refusing further interviews. Her name became a symbol of resilience. Trauma advocacy groups rallied around her, but she remained cautious, quiet, guarded, as if still listening for footsteps in the dark. One day, months after the final excavation of the St. Michael site, a construction worker tasked with hauling debris found a weather-worn notebook wedged beneath a collapsed ventilation duct. It was water-damaged, half-burned, the cover gone. But some pages survived. The handwriting was unmistakably Emma Drake's. She had kept writing, even after her escape attempt failed, even when she knew no one might ever read it. Her last legible entry was brief, tightly written in a shaking hand. Even silence can be a command, Doc. We obeyed it, Doc, and we paid for it. Investigators added the journal to the case archive. Maria asked for a copy. That week, the town of Marrow Creek held a quiet ceremony. Not a vigil, not a service, just a gathering in front of the old chapel ruins. No prayers, no speeches, just silence. At the edge of the crowd, someone had nailed a wooden sign to the fence. Burned into it were the words, "Are you sure it won't happen again?" No one took it down.